Hello, I'm Dr. Milescu, and today's lesson is from Anatomy and Physiology II Lab. We will be presenting Endocrine System for AMP2 Lab. I'm Dr. Milescu, and this is Dr. Saviuk, and we will be presenting this together. I have the human torso model, so we will be discussing the glands in detail, and then obviously showing the glands as to where the location is in the human torso model here, as an example. All right, so shall we begin?
So this is the age of Corona.
That's right.
So Dr. Milescu already has her mask on, and since we are socially distancing,
That's right.
I took mine off so that you could at least get a visual of me. And now I'm going to be putting it on to make sure that we stay as safe as possible. Hopefully you can all hear me, but let's talk about the endocrine system. You will have an outline in front of you in most cases that we have provided. And one of the things that the outline, of course, asks about is what structures are endocrine structures. Because in AP1 we learned about exocrine structures, exocrine sebaceous glands. Okay, we have exocrine sudoriferous or sweat glands. And so these are the factors that we should be in tune with. They all have ducts. The exocrine glands have ducts, which means they have a tube that allows their secretions to be initiated into the body or outside the body. Okay? Now, when we talk about endocrine glands do not have ducts. They are surrounded by capillary beds. And these capillary beds are important because, if you recall from AP1, capillaries are made of what type of tissue? The type of tissue that you should be thinking about is simple squamous epithelium. They are one cell layer thick, which allows for the diffusion of these molecules, these hormonal molecules, to enter the bloodstream. These are powerful hormonal molecules. Okay? So that's the major difference between exocrine and endocrine. So what type of structures make up our endocrine system? And as you can see from this chart, we have a grouping of these endocrine structures, and you will find that through the semester, we will be adding more of these endocrine structures from different parts of the body. Okay, these are the purest, except for the pancreas, which I'll mention in a few minutes. Okay, in the head, as you can see, in the what do you call cephalic region, we have the brain. All right. Now, what do we have in the inferior aspect of the brain, near the optic chiasm? Okay, we have a stalk that extends, and in AP1 we looked at the brain, we looked at the diencephalon. When we were looking at the diencephalon, we were looking at the epithalamus, the thalamus, and then the all-powerful hypothalamus. The hypothalamus today is considered one of, if not the major, okay, master gland, in conjunction with the pituitary. The hypothalamus is involved in the release of factors, and now we call them hormones, okay? They are releasing or inhibiting hormones that will effectuate, okay, both the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland, all right, which is housed, as you can see, in the sphenoid bone. And if you recall, this was one of those funky names because of the shallow depression that almost looks, well, I need a couple of stirrups here, it looks like a saddle. The celetursicum, okay? So we move to the posterior aspect of the brain. The posterior aspect, as you can see where I'm pointing here, is where we have the pineal gland. Now, what's that affiliated with? That's an extension of the epithalamus, okay? And that epithalamus, all right, which is the ceiling of the diencephalon, or the roof, okay, also has emanating from it, if you recall, the superior and inferior colliculum, which we called, if you recall again, see, I'm trying to, what do you call, stimulate your brain to think back, okay, the corpora quadrigemina. I feel like I'm speaking a
In
romantic language.
The magical language.
Exactly. So at any rate, the pineal gland. Well, what's the pineal gland generally noted for? It's noted for sleep-wake cycles, relaxation, melatonin, mother-infant bonding from a psychological aspect. Okay? So again, very brief at this point. Now we move down into the cervical region. And what do we see in the cervical region? We see a bilobular structure, 2 lobes, connected by a strip of tissue called the isthmus.
Yep, and you can see it right here on this human torso model. What I'm going to do is actually bring it up closer to the camera so you can see exactly its location. There it is. That is your thyroid gland. Okay, so let's continue.
Now, the thyroid gland is the seat of your metabolic rate. Okay? Metabolism is controlled by the thyroid gland. Okay? And of course, we have issues at times, but we'll talk about those in class. Okay? So here we have the thyroid gland, and as you can see in this depiction, we have 4 protrusions, okay? These rounded elevations. Those are the parathyroid glands. Now in this view, it looks like it's on the anterior surface, but being that this is a 2-dimensional arena, it's really on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. And these are involved with calcium metabolism, okay? We move down into the thoracic region, the chest, okay? We have removed, obviously, the rib cage. So where would we have this thymus? And what is the thymus? The thymus is one of the major, okay, lymphatic structures that help us maintain an immune response. Not the only one, but from literature, it has been called the heart of the immune system. And where is it? It is retrosternal, behind the sternum, in front of
Anterior.
superior, okay?
It's still going.
Okay, okay, it is anterior to the heart itself, okay? So this is the thymus gland. Now, we move down again into the abdominal region. Now, here we call this retroperitoneal. Why? Because it's behind the abdominal structures. So what do we see? Adrenal glands. 2 adrenal glands, 1 on top of each kidney. All right? Now, are they really intimately attached? Not really. But they're in close proximity, and via connective tissue fibers, it looks like the darn thing is hugging the kidneys. Okay? these are involved in various aspects of a stress response, okay? As well as a testosterone estrogen implication for maintenance of those structures while we are children, while we are adolescents, okay? Then of course the gonads take over, okay? So at any rate, we have stress hormones, cortisol, we have water retention, okay? And in this particular case, we have the secretion of aldosterone, and as I said, we have the secretion of androgens, which are the sex hormones, prepubescently. We now move down into the pancreas, and the pancreas, as you can see, okay, is located behind the stomach, okay, behind the stomach. The stomach would be in front of the pancreas.
Yep.
Okay.
So take the stomach out and
And
retroperitoneal.
exact, and it looks like it's, when we dissect the cat or even in the human, it's embedded in the mesentery, okay? The mesentery, and we talked about that again in AP1, the various coverings, okay? The mesentery connects the loops of the small intestine. This is a dual gland. This gland produces insulin and glucagon endocrinologically, okay? Insulin, of course, lowers blood sugar. Glucagon raises blood sugar.
It also releases, to a lesser extent, somatostatin.
Correct, okay? Somatostatin. The other thing why it's a dual gland is because it is also an exocrine gland. In this particular case, we have the pancreatic duct, which secretes digestive enzymes to break down all the different types of food materials, proteins, carbohydrates, and fats or lipids. Then from the pancreas, we move down to the gonads. And in this particular case, as you can see, we have the female gonads, the ovaries, the male gonads, the testes, and I'm not going to go into these to any great extent because that will be covered in our next section, the reproductive system.
Absolutely.
So let's take a look at the difference between how does this relate to the nervous system? Because we always talk about nervous system as the major controlling system, which, yes, it is. The endocrine system is the second major controlling system. The hormones effectuate various metabolic activities that occur in our body, and in many cases, these are graded events. Nervous system, instantaneous feedback. Endocrine can last for days, in some cases even months, okay? Even months, depending on how much stress you're under. If you're looking at an endocrine function that lasts for that period of about 28 days, you think of the menstrual cycle, okay? And we see so many of these different effects within the body. Here we see a kind of, comparison between our old TVs from years ago, okay, which took a long time. Today we have the internet, bam, look how much is going on in every room of the house, okay? It's instantaneous. Nervous system, endocrine system, okay? Here we see the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and this is something that I must stress, and Dr. Milescu will stress the same thing, you have to just sit down and memorize these hormones.
Put them on index cards.
Exactly. Put them on index cards, and we will supply you with various handouts that you can rely on, as well as these PowerPoints that you can study very effectively. Okay, and as you can see, the hypothalamus releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. We have an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary. Anterior, adeno hypophysis, adeno, comes from oral ectoderm, okay? Posterior pituitary, neurohypophysis. It is a direct outgrowth of the hypothalamic tissue.
Which is a direct link with the nervous system.
Exactly, exactly. So when you talk about hypothalamus, the implications from a neural point of view are implicit in the fact that this controls your behavior. It controls your sexuality, it controls your thirst, it controls your temperature, okay? And I'm just giving you general, unscientific at this point terminology, okay? To try to just give us an overview.
Hunger.
Hunger, oh my God, without a doubt.
Blame it on the hypothalamus.
The hypothalamus is monitoring the amino acids, the glucose in your blood. So all of this is sending messages to our brain that says, I'm hungry. After you eat, it says, I'm full. But then we say, no, I'm not. I want more. So, I mean, the implications are really interesting. But at any rate, here we go. And look at the type of hormones that are secreted. Okay? Number one, we look at the posterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary produces antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone is, as you can see, produced, okay, synthesized in the hypothalamus. It is not synthesized in the posterior pituitary. Please remember that. Okay, that's a question that you'll see
It's a
on
trick
exams.
question.
You'll see this on boards, you know, because everyone said, oh, the posterior, anterior, they produce and do everything. No.
You make the assumption posterior pituitary stores it, but the hypothalamus makes it,
Exactly.
synthesizes it.
Okay, so please remember that aspect. ADH, oxytocin. ADH acts on the kidney tubules to retain water. Oxytocin. Now, many of you have heard this, okay, this term during the birthing process. Okay? And when a female during that process has difficulty with the birthing itself, they give them a
Synthetic version.
which
Yep.
is called
Pitocin.
exactly.
Speaking from knowledge,
There we go.
unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's the only hormone in that whole barrage of hormones that actually does positive feedback. So the more it releases, the more is produced and released. I mean, it's just a wave. And if that wave doesn't happen, you're not going to dilate and deliver the baby. So that's why now doctors synthetically give IV Pitocin to induce labor and delivery. Induces the contractions.
Exactly. Exactly. So this is, again, an extremely important consideration during that trying time that a mother is going through. Okay? Now we look at the anterior pituitary. Well, we also see on our outline a term called tropic hormones. What's a tropic? And it's spelled like tropic. Mm-hmm. Okay? We're in the tropics. But in this case, what does the term refer to? It refers to stimulating something in a different area. So in this case, the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus are going to stimulate the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary that are going to stimulate, as you can see, various activities in our body. So let's take a look at that. Okay, growth hormone. Growth hormone, stimulating hormone. As an example, okay, it's going to stimulate growth of bone and muscle, of mitosis. Okay, when you're growing, bone and muscle are the most evident. We see those growth spurts, etc. But when we become adults, what are we doing? Are we still growing? No.
Maintaining.
We're replacing. Replenishing.
Yeah, it's more about maintenance.
Exactly. And so growth hormone never stops being produced.
Throughout your lifetime.
Here we have ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, okay, which is stimulated by the hypothalamus, okay, stimulating hormone, which then is going to stimulate the adrenal gland to produce adrenocorticosteroids, okay, cortisol, specifically, okay, specifically, cortisol. Then we have thyroid stimulating hormone, okay? Thyroid stimulating hormone is then going to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones, and thyroid hormones, of course, metabolic.
T3, T4.
Exactly. Okay?
T4 is thyroxine.
There we go. All right? Then we have the sexual hormones. Okay? And in this particular case, or gonadal hormones, depending on how you view this, we're going to produce follicle stimulating hormone in both the male and female. And follicle stimulating hormone, of course, stimulates the growth of our sperm cells. Okay, just like in the female, the growth of the egg cells. Okay? LH is the hormone that causes the maturation, ultimately. Okay, and here you see a abbreviation ICSH, interstitial cell stimulating hormone. What LH stimulates are those interstitial cells of Leydig that are going to secrete testosterone.
Yep. And the way I teach my students to delineate between FSH and LH, since they are both hormones that are sex hormones and affect the gonads. FSH, think of a follicle as a nest. So think of nest equals egg. Sperm is also a seed, egg, right? So egg and sperm. So FSH, follicle, think of the nest. So that would be the development. So FSH stimulates the development of the sperm and the egg, whereas LH is more hormonal and affects the growth and development sexually for a male and a female, so increases the testosterone level, which thereby increases the sexual maturation of the male. And of course, LH will also stimulate the ovaries to release more estrogen, which causes the secondary sexual characteristics of a female and causes the maturation. So that's pretty much how you delineate the difference between FSH and LH.
A beautiful analogy. I love that. The last one, of course, is prolactin, and prolactin stimulates the production of milk, nutrients for the infant once it is born.
Let's point out the difference here.
Right.
So this is, I just want to point this out because it's quite important. So oxytocin not only induces labor and delivery, also secondarily is going to be a hormone that helps bond with the infant and in turn release the milk. The initial milk letdown is caused by oxytocin. But then the continual production of milk, if the child bonds and continues to nurse, then the prolactin kicks in and continued production of milk occurs. And it all starts from the hypothalamus because it releases prolactin releasing hormone. So all of the hormones in the hypothalamus, most of them will have releasing, the word releasing in the phrase. So prolactin releasing hormone in the hypothalamus will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release prolactin, which then causes the release and milk production continuum. Now what happens once nursing ends? Then of course prolactin inhibiting hormone kicks in and the milk production, the prolactin diminishes and milk production diminishes as well. Negative feedback.
That's right. Remember that?
Yep.
Process of homeostasis.
Yep.
Negative feedback. Positive feedback, remember, enhances. Okay? And as that child is, that infant is pushing, okay, on the uterus, the signals are going up, positive feedback, until birthing occurs and then inhibition. Okay? Negative feedback. All right? So a good way to analyze that. ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Let me just give you another term for that. It is called vasopressin. Why? Because it causes constriction of the tubules in the kidneys to retain water. Okay? Antidiuretic.
And I might add, if you get inebriated or you drink lots of coffee, it is a diuretic.
That's correct.
That is why we get dehydrated with coffee and alcohol, because it suppresses ADH.
That's another good thing to remember. Very good. Okay, here we see just a more visual arena between the two, okay, of the posterior pituitary, okay, and the anterior pituitary. And here you can see direct neural, okay, stimulation for the release of oxytocin and ADH, okay, kidney tubules, uterine muscles, mammary glands, okay, and I like the way they have shown the affiliation of our capillaries, okay. In this view, again, what do we see? We see the neurosecretory cells, okay, from our hypothalamus, okay, secreting directly into a primary vascular network, okay, that then is going to send those releasing factors into a secondary network, okay, which will stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete, and this is what you have to remember, TSH, ACTH, FSH, LH, growth hormone, prolactin, and endorphins. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay.
Memorize those 7.
They'll come in handy. Pituitary tumors. This is an aside. I think Dr. Milescu will address this to give you a guide as to the type of tumors. And from personal experience, most, I'm not going to say all, but most pituitary tumors are adeno. Okay, they're epithelial tumors. They, in most cases, are not metastatic and can be dealt with, okay? But they can cause tremendous problems.
Yes, and the only way to enter is intranasally, since it is in the deep recesses, as you know, sits on top of the sella turcica, and which is part of the sphenoid bone. If you remember back in AMP1, the shape of the sphenoid bone, interior cranium, the center was the sella turcica, and then the bat wings, because remember it looked like a little bat inside your head. Okay, you had the greater and the lesser sphenoid. So I'm just trying to, take the cobwebs out so you could relate to how deep that is and how difficult it is for a surgeon to get access to it. And so intranasally is the way we go. And I think we don't have a skull now, but we can grab one.
Yeah,
There's one in the sink.
What's that?
So anyway, the pituitary gland, I'm just going to do a small little review so you could remember. Remember, there's the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. With the anterior pituitary, you need to remember that there are several hormones. So put them on index cards, understand the processes and what they're doing. So for example, there's several in the anterior, but only 2 in the posterior. So memorize the 2 first, ADH and oxytocin, right? Then anterior pituitary, we had the growth hormone, right? Then we had TSH for the thyroid gland, okay? We had ACTH, which goes to the adrenal gland to release cortisol, okay? And that's something we're gonna talk about very soon because cortisol causes stress, chronic stress. Chronic stress is going to release more cortisol, which then releases more glucose and lipids, and that in turn causes heart disease and diabetes and and hypertension. So these are all secondary disease characteristics because of chronic stress. All right, so did you want to show where the sella turcica is? Here it is. So if I'm gonna come right close here, there's the sella turcica. So you can see the only access is obviously intranasal to get to the sella turcica, which of course the pituitary gland sits on top. And there's the bat in your head that I was talking about, right? So you had the greater and lesser sphenoid. This whole bone here is called the sphenoid bone. And the sella turcica is our highlight because that's where the pituitary gland sits on top.
Yep.
All right, I'll put this right here.
So that brings us to our thyroid hormones. Okay, and as you can see, the thyroid is literally attached to our larynx, okay, the inferior portion of the laryngeal region, okay. Here is the Adam's apple, okay. Here is, which is the thyroid cartilage.
Yep.
Right underneath is the cricoid, okay. And then, of course, we start to see some of our trachea, okay? So this is attached to that inferior aspect, as you can see right over here, okay, of our...
I'll bring it back
Yep.
to the camera so you can see real close here. This here is the thyroid gland. This is the cartilage, as you can see. The thyroid cartilage, so it's inferior to the thyroid cartilage. Thyroid cartilage, thyroid gland.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, as you're visualizing this particular structure, this is the gland responsible for the production of T3, triiodothyronine, and T4, which is quatriiodothyronine or thyroxine. Now, the key word here is iota. And I ask this every semester. What do you think iodo stands for? IOD. Okay? Iodo. All right? Iodine. Okay? And so few students look outside the box because it's almost intuitive, and they go like, no, can't
And
be.
T3 is not the active form.
No.
T4 is the one that you want. That's the one that actually works and regulates your metabolism.
And that's why it's so important that if you have a thyroid issue, that you get checked, not just for T3, T4, you get checked for thyroid releasing hormone.
That's right.
As well as TSH, so TRH and TSH.
To find out the root cause of either too high or too low.
Exactly. Hypothyroidism or hyper. All right? So that is produced by our thyroid gland. But there's a second function, endocrine function. And that is we have what we call parafollicular cells. The follicles are where we produce thyroid hormones. The parafollicular cells are a population of cells that produce calcitonin. Calcitonin is extremely important for the reduction of excess calcium in the blood.
So too much, if you have plenty, like let's say you drank 3 glasses of milk, you have more than extra calcium that your body needs to store. That's when the calcitonin kicks in. Your thyroid gland releases calcitonin, and all that calcium that's in your bloodstream from the metabolism of the milk, okay, is going to get into the bone. How? Well, the calcitonin stimulates the osteoblasts, B for building. Osteoblasts build bone, so therefore that calcium gets stored in the bone as calcium phosphate. And that's why they tell us to drink milk.
Exactly. And so consequently, as I said, this becomes an important parameter for that maintenance. Now, from a disease point of view, you also have to be very careful. Too much calcium or too little calcium, hypo or hyper, can cause cardiac malfunction, okay?
Absolutely.
Among other things, but the cardiac influence is quite vital in this particular
If
case.
you remember AMP1 and muscle contraction, calcium was a key component in attaching to troponin on the thin filament, and where the thin filament and the thick filament came together and caused muscle contraction. Too much calcium, you're going to have too much contraction. How's that going to work out for the heart? No, it's going to put the heart at a higher heart rate, and it's going to work harder, and that's never a good thing.
Exactly. And it's funny because the first thing that students will say to me, oh, that's tetany. Well, the heart doesn't go into tetany. The heart just goes into tachycardia, and sustained tachycardia, fast heartbeat, can ultimately cause a heart attack.
Right, it's going to cause eventually a permanent electrical change, and therefore you could read that on an EKG.
Now, here we can see thyroid hormone feedback and effects. As we talked about before, negative feedback. Where are we getting all of this hormonal influence? Thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, okay, is going to stimulate thyroid stimulating hormone to be released from the anterior pituitary. That then stimulates the thyroid gland to produce the thyroid hormones, T3, T4. And as we stated before, increased metabolism, growth, development, and increased catecholamine effect. What is catecholamine? Epinephrine, okay? Which we may think back, what is epinephrine referred to? Adrenaline.
Gives you that power boost, that burst of energy short term.
Exactly, okay? Then, once we have metabolized, well, I no longer need that hormone in its concentrated form. So what happens? I send a message back, negative feedback to say, hey,
Enough.
I have enough food, I feel satisfied, I don't need to metabolize, and the mechanism slows down. Nothing ever shuts off, nothing. Okay, parathyroid glands. All right, now here is a terrific little, display of what's going on. Hypocalcemia, I have low blood calcium. Now I stimulate the parathyroid glands on the posterior aspect of the thyroid.
And then it has the effects to all these organs.
Because again, I don't want you guys to think that, boom, it's only osteoblasts and osteoclasts.
No.
In this particular case, what am I stimulating? Osteoclasts. Why?
Right.
Because they're going to break down the calcium. They secrete a hydrochloric acid constituent that literally dissolves the bone so that I can get some calcium. But if I relied strictly on this, I'd be osteoporotic within a week.
Yes, so instead we also stimulate the intestine via this hormone. So this PTH hormone stimulates the intestine to increase the calcium absorption from the food that we eat. So now there's obviously more calcium.
And then, of course, we stimulate the kidney, okay? And what does this do? Increases calcium reabsorption, so I don't lose as much calcium. But it also promotes, and this is super important, vitamin D. Okay? Activation of vitamin D so that I can absorb the calcium. And that's why these days we see that constant reminder in your diet, make sure you get enough calcium, magnesium, vitamin D.
And of course, some natural sunlight will also activate your vitamin D.
Exactly. I was just talking to a cardiologist who was telling me this COVID virus, okay, to enhance the immune system, zinc, vitamin D, vitamin C, as well as echinacea. Now, some people may not believe in nutrients
Herbs, yeah.
and herbs, but it certainly has been touted by the medical profession as a way of enhancing the immune
Turmeric
system.
as well.
Turmeric as
Yeah.
well, exactly. Okay, the thymus gland. Well, remember we talked about this before on the model, just for a second, and unfortunately, in the
over here.
model we don't see.
Yeah, you're not going to see it on the model, but it's right anterior to the aortic arch, basically. Superior to the heart.
And so consequently, in this particular case, you can see it's a massive tissue. Okay, here's the thyroid, here's
Yep.
the thymus.
And this is the aortic arch coming out.
Exactly. See how it literally covers it. It's, I mean, we're going to be doing labs online so that I'll try to show you via a dissection of a cat, which unfortunately you're going to miss doing it hands-on. But you'll see how large that thymus is in the cat. Why? Because obviously they're foragers in a rather, what do you call, filthy arena.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in a dog,
I would say going after rats and mice is pretty filthy.
not a good thing. But what's neat is if you look anatomically at children, children have gigantic thymuses. As we age,
It shrinks.
unfortunately, it shrinks.
And it turns to fat like everything else.
Yes, exactly. A lump.
Yeah.
Okay, a lump in our chest. So at any rate, what happens is, what is this for? And here you can see killer T cells. The thymus stores, matures, and actually grows its population of T cells.
I look at it this way. The way I teach my students is your stem cells, you know, in the blood, right, are forming where? In the bone marrow. Okay, so you've got the white blood cells, the red blood cells, and the platelets are stem cells that form in the bone marrow, and they develop into the differentiating cells. Once we get to the T cells, yes, they are born and grow to a certain extent in the bone marrow. But think of them as little cadets. And here is their training camp. And this is where they really grow and mature and become the big bag T cells and go after the bad guys, the virus.
Exactly. So this is an antiviral, okay, army.
That's boot camp right there.
Yeah, you got that right.
That's where they're training.
And they're getting ready to fight.
That's right.
Okay? And so in many cases, as I tell my students, the research that was done on the thymus gland back 40 years ago, when I was still a fledgling doctor, okay, the bottom line was that this thyroid gland, this thymus gland, was shown to become stimulated by a person's psyche as well. Okay? So that if you're a negative person and you're constantly walking around going like Eeyore, oh my goodness.
Woe is me.
Am I going to survive? Am I going to pass this test? Am I going to be able to remember all of this? The thymus just becomes smaller, shrinks quicker, etc. But if you're positive, they were actually able to test and see the increased production of T cells in this gland. That was pretty amazing.
And we could link that to the fact that the thymus gland is healthier when we exercise, because when we exercise, we release these happy hormones, endorphins,
right.
And therefore your immune system is also going to be much more potent. Your thymus gland will be healthy, and your T cells will fight the COVID. So that's where we're linking it.
We're linking.
Yeah.
Exactly. The pancreas, okay, again, as I said, behind the stomach, embedded in the loop of the small intestine, okay, this is the duodenum.
Yep, and you can see it here. We have the model. This is the pancreas, and hugging it in like a C-shaped structure right here is the first portion of the small intestine called the duodenum. In some places they say duodenum, whichever one you want to choose. I say duodenum.
Yeah, exactly. And so what happens, as you can see, here we have the pancreatic duct, okay, which is going to, in this particular case, bring in the, digestive enzymes. But the pancreas itself is made up of a population of two types of cells. Okay, again, something you have to remember. Beta cells produce insulin. Okay, beta cells produce insulin. Here we are. Dr.Milescu is pointing this out.
Yep.
Okay, alpha cells produce glucagon. Okay, and this is what our bodies are doing continuously throughout the day. If you have high blood sugar, you just got up in the morning, you ate your cereal, you had coffee with sugar and cream, what did you do? You increased sugar in your blood. What is sugar? Glucose. Okay, and so consequently what happens is insulin is released by the pancreas.
What I want to add to that is that when you're constantly eating sugary meals, your body eventually says, you know what, I'm done here, literally, because you're stimulating this whole cycle of, okay, stimulate the pancreas because there's a lot of sugar in the blood, a lot of glucose. Pancreas releases insulin, pancreas releases insulin. We'll do that enough times over a lifetime. Eventually, the body will become insulin resistant.
Correct.
The cells, specific cells in the body, are just not going to be open to a receptor, literally, because it's a receptor-mediated issue, where the glucose with the insulin is going to bind to the insulin receptor across the cell. And if it is pretty much kaput and we've got resistance, that glucose is not going to get into the cell. It's going to stay outside of the cell, which means it's in the blood. And that's the hyperglycemic state. So if after 2 hours you've eaten a meal that's filled with sugar and you still did not bring your blood sugar to 120 or less, then you are considered a diabetic. And that's how we test it, the 2-hour glucose test.
Exactly, exactly. And so what happens is you're constantly overstimulating, constantly overstimulating. You're weakening the pancreas.
Yes.
Pancreas is now in that state of exhaustion.
Yes.
Okay? And this is what happens in our bodies. We are in a state of stress. And this is what, again, but I'm not stressed. Yes, you are, because you're not eating properly. You're not exercising. And so what happens is, ultimately, the pancreas breaks down.
And that's adult onset diabetes,
Exactly.
type 2.
Right.
Very different than type 1. Type 1 can happen in childhood. Some nasty virus, a flu per se,
Exactly.
might have destroyed these beta cells. And now there's absolutely no production of insulin. And that's a whole different story. Through no fault of that person, it's just, it happens. And so that's
in some cases, it's genetically passed down.
Yes.
And so that poor child is born with this predisposition and has to be on insulin for a lifetime. Okay? Now, if we have high blood sugar, you've just eaten that sugary meal. Okay? Insulin is going to lower the blood sugar. So you're going to go from hyperglycemia to hypoglycemia. And this is the normal state. Okay? But now you're sitting around, you're in a classroom, you're at your computer, and you go, oh boy, I feel a fog hitting me.
Yep.
Well, within about 10, 15, 20 minutes, you might say, wow, what happened? I feel awake again. Well, in our bodies, the pancreas says, okay, well, the brain really says, hey, I need glucose. I need something, but you're not feeding me. So what it does is it secretes glucagon. Okay? Now what does glucagon do? Glucagon stimulates, okay, the breakdown of glycogen, which is the storage vehicle, the major storage vehicle, major polysaccharide that is stored in the liver, and it breaks it down into glucose.
And now the free glucose molecules are floating around in your bloodstream and your brain is happy again.
And breaking down glycogen to glucose, what process do we use?
Gluconeogenesis.
Well, that's the buildup.
The buildup.
The buildup, okay?
And then breakdown is glycolysis.
Glycolysis, exactly. But for glycolysis to occur, what chemical process is happening? Hydrolysis.
Yep.
Okay? For building glycogen, we use dehydration synthesis. Okay? Again, as practitioners, as nurses, you're not going to be talking to your patient about this, but these are questions you
Oh
may
yeah, it's very
encounter.
important to understand that when you have plenty of glucose in the blood and you just had a meal, like let's say you had, I don't know, a cappuccino with a cannoli, that's a whole lot of sugar. Okay, if your body's working properly, your pancreas is going to release from the beta cells the insulin, and that was the process where now we're going to make glycogen. So that's the gluconeogenesis versus glycolysis, which is breakdown. So the glycogen breaks down into free glucose when the blood sugar is what magical number? Usually below 50 is when glucagon really truly kicks in.
That's right.
And raises your blood sugar until you could temporarily, function to the next meal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So all of this, as you can see, what do I need the glucose for? I need it for muscle contraction. Okay? I need it for heart function. Okay? I need it for the production of energy. All right? And what happens is, of course, we see kidney here, we see fat. Why? Because the kidney has to excrete excess glucose, which is hard on the kidney when you eat too much sugar. Okay? And excess glucose that does not become glycogen
Becomes
is stored as
fat.
Okay? Fat.
It's a bad word, isn't it?
Oh, it's and that brings us to the adrenal glands. Okay? Remember we talked about the intimacy of the adrenal glands sitting on top of the kidneys. We see adrenal in addition to the kidney. Now I see new terminology. They call it suprarenal glands.
I saw that, yeah.
Okay? Telling us where is it on the superior aspect of the kidney. So either or tells us what this structure or where this structure is. Okay? And of course, as you can see, this wonderful
Rage.
human being, stress. Okay? Now that, of course, is external stress. Many of us face internal stresses, which we in some cases internalize. We don't even realize we're under that much stress. And ultimately, what happens is we start releasing the hormones. Okay? Corticotropic releasing hormone stimulates adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will then stimulate the adrenal gland to produce cortisol. Okay? And cortisol is a catch-all word for cortisone. And if any of us have ever taken cortisone, we know what it does to our body. It causes water retention. It causes puffiness. In some cases, short term, it really is not as bad, but long-term in some cases, the same as what stress would do to our body. It suppresses the immune response ultimately.
Yeah, and out of this whole cortisol, we've come up with a slew of steroid medications out there. Everything from, yes, cortisone to prednisone to Depomedrol to all of those. Dexamethasone, these are some of the treatments now that we are doing for COVID to diminish the huge T-cell response and inflammatory response to the virus.
Exactly. And so what happens is, in this particular case, we can see the short-term response. What happens is we got autonomically, the autonomic nervous system, okay, the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal gland directly, okay, and this is the adrenal medulla. The hormones that I am talking about, that Dr. Milescu was mentioning, are all produced in the cortex, the outer shell, okay? And so in this particular case, we secrete epinephrine, norepinephrine, adrenaline.
I think it's important to distinguish between the two because this is short term. So the center, the core of the adrenal gland, we call it the medulla. This is fight or flight. This is when you see a bear and normal reaction is to run.
Right.
And you have superhuman strength because of norepinephrine and epinephrine. What's the difference between norepinephrine and epinephrine? A few little molecules, but they're both supercharged adrenaline to get you out of danger. So this is a short term, get you out of danger. This is the body constantly thinking it's in danger because it's a chronic stress response. And of course, that's the cortisol. And there's a whole slew of hormones there as well, not just.
And now, well, here we talk about glucocorticoids,
Exactly.
which is cortisol. And we also talk about
mineralocorticoids,
mineralocorticoids, which is aldosterone. And aldosterone, what happens in this particular case is that this particular hormone, when we are dehydrated, becomes very important. When we're under stress, however, okay, the oversecretion of aldosterone causes excess retention of sodium. When you retain sodium, it draws in water. Now this will increase your blood volume and blood pressure. So people under prolonged stress will be subject to high blood pressure, increased heart rate, increased ventilation, and over time, if this is not addressed, can cause the body to literally break down.
And that's all because of the blood volume. So
Exactly.
when you put more fluid, obviously the arteries, everything is under stress. The heart rate, the heart has to pump harder to push the blood through the distal organs and extremities.
And in this particular case, you may have heard of ACE inhibitors, okay, like lisinopril.
Yep.
Lisinopril is a medication that is an ACE inhibitor, and what that ultimately does is it inhibits the conversion of precursors to aldosterone. And consequently, when that happens, it helps to lower the blood pressure because
You're not retaining the water.
Exactly.
Yep. Now you're going to urinate it out.
Exactly.
And your blood pressure goes down simply because the blood volume goes down.
And so when you're doing the cortisol, as you can see, what are we doing? We're breaking down excess protein. And in some cases, where's our excess protein? In our muscle.
And we never want that. Nobody
No
wants
way.
that.
And the fats. Now what happens, you go like, oh, that's cool.
No.
Breaks down fat. Well, no, because what it does is it converts the fats into sugars, into glucose. And what happens is I excrete a little bit, but it redistributes.
Yep.
So now I have more problems. Okay?
Chronic hyperglycemia, which leads to diabetes.
Diabetes, kidney failure, fatty liver, cirrhosis, etc. And you're not even a drinker.
Yeah.
Okay? And so suppression of the immune system. And when that happens, it's...
And this is the reason why they say people at risk are high blood pressure, right? Diabetes are more at risk to COVID than others because of all of this right here. You just learned it.
And the key, remember what Dr. Milescu just mentioned, okay? And weight, increased weight.
That's part of it.
Which is part of this unfortunate cycle. And so someone will say, but you know, I used to be 100 pounds less or 50 pounds less, and look at me now. Well, this is what happened. When you are under that constant pressure and you're taking steroids on top of it, your body starts to break down.
Yep.
Okay. This gonads, okay, as we mentioned before, the ovaries and testes in the male, okay, basically this has to do with hormonal changes, the maturation of, as Dr. Milescu mentioned before, the eggs or seeds, okay, growing and then being stimulated to mature, okay, and LH is that hormone that is going to be involved in the maturation and the secretion of estrogens, which causes more maturation, and in the case of the male, LH causes the maturation of the sperm via the interstitial cell stimulating hormone, which LH is called in that situation, and we'll talk about this, and which then of course stimulates testosterone release. This we'll talk about in our next section on the reproductive system.
I agree. I think this is a whole other topic, the menstrual cycle, which I love to talk about. So I will definitely give a nice synopsis on the menstrual cycle regarding FSH, LH, estrogen, progesterone, and all that.
And this will be, as I say, a separate discussion. And it was nice.
We're finished.
It was nice to talk to you.
High five, thank you. Well, actually, it's got to be this now in the COVID.
There we go.
There we go. We're safe.
We did it.
All right. Take care, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video. Bye.
Bye-bye now.